Today's Friday, December 9th, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. And I'd like to talk a little bit today about parenting and managing the behavior of children because, well, first of all, I'm a father with 10 children, and it's a very important topic in my own daily activity. And as a teacher, I would be lying to parents if I allowed them to think that the behavior of their children doesn't affect their opportunities in education, because they most certainly do. So I'd like to take some time to think and talk about the behavior of children and parenting. Now, I know that this talk will offend some people because anytime that we talk about a controversial subject and we talk about an undesirable situation, those who live in that situation will be either moved to change by that conversation, or they'll be, quote unquote, offended. And they'll criticize the conversation rather than the problem. So I can't control that, but I can say sincerely that my interest is not to offend anyone, but to encourage, to recommend an ideal path for us to pursue and to try to offer some help in the pursuit of it. Last night, it was the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, and my wife and I, with our kids, went to Mass to honor the Holy Day of Obligation. We went at 6 p.m. and we sat where we normally sit in our parish, and there was a mother with a few little children in front of us. And as we were sitting there, I couldn't help but watch and see how the mother managed these little children. Now, our family, through the years, has always been praised for the behavior of our children in church. We're always told how quiet our children are. Even, for example, when my sons started wrestling, their coach commented on just how quiet they are. And there's a reason for that. We teach our kids to be quiet. We teach them to sit and be respectful. We teach them to not distract other people. We teach them, and we make them act like that by discipline. So we normally hear from people that our children are well behaved and they're quiet and respectful and this and that. And they should be. That shouldn't be something unusual. That should be normal. As I was watching this woman with a few young children, she sat down in the pew, and the first thing I noticed that was strange was that she didn't hold her children. She had one child that was just started walking, and I don't know, I'm not able to look at a child and guess the age. My wife could do that. My wife could tell me, if I asked her, how old is that child? She could tell me to the month. I can't do that, but I would guess 2-ish, and another child that I think was a little older. And this 2-ish-year-old was just loose, walking around, talking, making noises, yelling, walking into other pews. affecting other people who were present at Mass. And the mother of this child sat there and watched the child as she moved around through the aisle, across the aisle, into a pew, into another pew, yelling, making all kinds of noise. The mother sat there and watched, and if the child started to go too far, the mother would get up and walk over and take the child by the hand and lead her back to the mother's pew. And the mother simply watched the child as the child wandered around in the sanctuary making noise, and I don't care what anyone says, bothered other parishioners. None of the parishioners came to Mass to keep an eye on this child. None of the other parishioners came to Mass on a Thursday evening to be distracted by a wandering 2 or 3-year-old. They came to Mass to fulfill their duty to honor this holy day in the church. And there are readings to listen to, there's a homily to listen to, there are prayers to listen to and offer to God. And the way I look at it is that the other parishioners have come not for me or for my children, but for the Lord's sake. And it's my responsibility to control my children so that they don't distract other parishioners from the objective of the Mass. And yet I watched as this woman let the child wander and would only react if it seemed like the child was bothering someone too much or was getting worse, or if the child started to wander too far. And the mother, like I said, would go, walk over, take this little child by the hand and walk her back to the pew, and then sit down and just let the child loose again. And to me, this is just bizarre. It makes no sense how someone can think that that's a good idea for how to manage a little child. I know when my children were young, and I'm talking babies and toddlers, they were either in a car seat, in my wife's arms, or in my arms. Young children were pulled over and put on my lap during Mass. They were always within an arm's reach. If they started to fuss around or move or be silly or anything, I would get their attention and make them stop. If a child started to fuss or cry, my wife would take the child out to the cry room so no one else is distracted by our child. And so our children learned that they're to sit in their pew, they're to pay attention to the Mass, they're to stand when it's time to stand, sit when it's time to sit, kneel when it's time to kneel, and follow the instructions of the Mass, of the liturgy of the Mass. And they have no option but to do so. And if they didn't, they would be punished. So, for example, on a Sunday, if we were at Mass and during Mass, 2 of my kids were fooling around and I had to tell them to stop, I'd give them a warning, and if they kept fooling around, they would lose their lunch after Mass. They would lose their free time after Mass. They knew that if they fooled around at church during Mass, they would pay for it. And it didn't take them long to learn not to fool around at Mass. People would come up to me and say, "How do you get your kids to sit so still?" And I would look these people right in their eyes and tell them, they have to be quiet at Mass. They have to. Because if they don't, they're not going to eat when we go home. And I can remember people looking at me and laughing as if I was joking. But I wasn't joking. They had to be quiet at Mass. They had to sit and keep to themselves at Mass, or they would be punished for it. And the kids knew that. When we got out of Mass and went back to the car, I would often get into the car and get ready to leave and have a kid ask, "Dad, was I okay at Mass today?" They knew that they had to behave at Mass. And the same behavior that was required of them at Mass was required of them at home. As a homeschooling family, we're studying at home. We're doing our full-time studies together at home. In order to study, we can't have crazy distractions. In order to study, children need to sit. They need to read. They need to do memory work. They need to write. These are quiet, sedentary, or at least stationary activities. They have to learn to be quiet and still for the sake of work and study, or they can't make progress in those studies. And we can think that it's cute to have kids climbing around, running around, acting silly. We can say, "Oh, look how cute, this is so funny." But the purpose of parents is not to seek to be entertained by our children. We are given to our children to teach and discipline them, to prevent them from developing bad habits in their youth, and to help them develop or at least experience good habits during their youth. When our children are minors, they're under our control. They're dependents. They live in our home. They are dependent on our financial support and provision. They're legally accountable to their parents. We're responsible for them just as the police are responsible to stop a criminal. If you were at a mall and a man tried to steal a woman's purse and there was a police officer standing there and the police officer smiled, you would accuse that police officer of not doing his job. And yet, when we watch as children misbehave and their parents just watch them or allow them, we're pressured to act as if that's okay. But it's just like a police officer not preventing a crime that he's present at. A good example, an extreme example, but a good example that's fresh in our minds would be the Uvalde school shooting. These police officers have been crucified by the media and the American public because they didn't do what was in their power to stop that shooter. We understand that preventing crime is the duty of law enforcement officers. We know that they can't stop all crime, but they're to use all of their resources, which we all pay for through taxation, to prevent crime. And if crime is allowed, we look at the law enforcement and say, what the heck are you doing? This is your role in our society. You've taken an oath as a police officer to serve and protect the public. This is your purpose. This is your responsibility. You have powers and privileges that I, as an ordinary citizen, don't have. And you're supposed to use those powers and privileges to protect the public. And I know people can talk their tough talk and how they're going to carry a gun themselves, but that's idle talk. Individual citizens can't do what a police force can do. They don't have the resources, they don't have the manpower to stop crime. That's what the police are paid to do. And in the same way, just as the police serve as the law enforcement at the state level, parents serve as the law enforcement at the domestic level or the household level. It's your job as a parent to prevent your children from harming or bothering or taking from other people. That's your responsibility. And so, if I bring my children to church, you can be certain that I'm going to make sure that they don't distract anyone, don't bother anyone, don't prevent anyone from hearing the readings or the homily. They're going to sit in their pew. They're going to be respectful and quiet, or they're going to get punished. And through the years, all of my children have been very well behaved at church. And again, this behavior is required also at home. They're not allowed to run wild in the house. They're not allowed to run around screaming and yelling. They're not allowed to goof around and run wild when we're a homeschooling family and we have studies to do. Even if a certain child doesn't want to study, he's not allowed to prevent other children from studying. And that's true of all of our children, from infants all the way up to adult children in the house. If an adult student or one of our adult children is home from college, let's say, and he's home, he's off, he's free for the day, but the kids have to study, he's not allowed to just tear the place up. He's not allowed to sit down and turn the television on in the middle of the house. It's a school day in our house. We're a homeschooling family. The house is going to be quiet. The kids are studying. My wife and I are responsible for the behavior of our children when they're young, just as the police are responsible for the behavior of the society or the community in general. We don't have the power or privilege to do all that the police are authorized to do, but most of the problems in the community can be prevented by the action, the responsible action of parents. And this is not just criminal matters, this is also moral. This is also matters of etiquette. I'm not simply required to prevent my child from murdering someone at Mass. I'm responsible to prevent my child from distracting someone at Mass. It's my responsibility. They're my children, and I'm their father. And the reason why my children behave well at Mass is not because they're all saints. It's because they have to. They know that they have to. And the little bit of fooling around or wildness that they would do at church is not worth the consequences. And the behavior that we expect of them at church, like I said, that behavior is also taught and enforced at home. We don't bring a bunch of wild acrobats juiced up on sugar and candy and who knows what else. We don't drag them into church fresh out of, the playground and let them loose in the sanctuary. And there are kids who, it seems that that's what their parents are doing. And I know that there are parents who will listen to this and say, "Oh, who are you to say?" No, this is normal etiquette. This is normal social behavior. They're your children. You're their guardian and parent. It's your responsibility, for the sake of your neighbor, to control and discipline your own children. I'm not the crazy person. The person who lets his or her kids loose in a sanctuary is the person who needs to correct their behavior. They're the rude people, not the person saying parents should control their children. And the church is gentle. If you come to Mass and you don't have your children under control, the church doesn't tell you to get out and go home. The church has actually constructed a place where you can bring your disorderly children and enjoy all the benefits of the liturgy and of the sacraments without distracting other people. And that's a kindness and courtesy of the church. The church didn't have to build that room, didn't have to invest in that room for young children to sit where they could make noise and not distract. The church didn't need to do that. The church chose to do that as a courtesy to parents with young children. And that room should be used. Like I said, if our children started to fuss, a baby started to cry, a toddler wasn't feeling well or was sleepy and started to fuss around, my wife would simply take the child to the cry room. No big deal. And it prevents anyone else from being bothered by our children. We would never even think twice about that. It's simply the golden rule. And yet parents today will complain that they can't just let their children loose in the sanctuary or let them scream their heads off, as if other people being annoyed by the distraction are the bad guys and what they're doing is good. And asking them to move to a cry room out of courtesy towards other people is an offense to them. It's just selfish craziness. But we're responsible for the behavior of our children. We cannot allow bad habits to develop, and we have to promote and cultivate in our children good habits. And it's natural and quite easy, really, to do this when our children are young and dependent on us in our homes, in our families. It's normal for children to be subject to their parents. It's natural for parents to control the behavior of their children and to take responsibility for the effects of the behavior of their children. If a woman brings a child into a store and lets the child loose and the child breaks something, that woman should pay for it because it's her child and she's responsible for her child's behavior. I know when I was a child, if I did something bad, my mother had to pay for it. I remember one event where I was a young kid and a friend of mine and I were in the street where we used to play in central New Jersey, and we were throwing and hitting rocks in the street. He would throw a rock and I would hit it with a baseball bat. And we were playing around, but we were acting badly. And my parents weren't even watching us, didn't even know what we were doing, and I hit a rock and it took off and broke one of my neighbor's windows. My neighbors came out of the house angry, and they didn't come and yell at me. They walked down the street to my house and knocked on my front door and demanded that my parents pay for that window. And they did. We can laugh and say, oh, it's just kids. This is what kids do. That's right. This is what kids do. And it's why in nature kids are given to parents so that they don't do this. Because this is what kids do. It's not the responsibility of the neighbors to laugh when their windows are broken. It's not the responsibility of the shopkeepers who are trying to make a living and have to turn a profit in a competitive market to giggle off the destruction in the store caused by an unsupervised child. It's not our community's responsibility to bear with the bad behavior of other people's children. It's our responsibility as parents to supervise and keep our children from doing things that harm our neighbors. That's the golden rule. They're our children. We're responsible for them. The community is not responsible for our children. Now this gets even more ridiculous when many of these parents who don't take any responsibility for their children will then turn around and complain that they should have the last say over what the schools teach their children and all this kind of stuff. It's strange how they claim these parental privileges when they're convenient, but they don't claim these parental responsibilities. It's true. They're your children. That's why you're responsible for them. And as I said, in this example from my own parish, there was a woman who allowed this child to wander through the sanctuary during Mass and had sort of a certain limit of obnoxious behavior that would actually trigger her to stop the child. But up until that level, the child was allowed to go and bother other people, walk into other people's pews, touch their stuff, bang on their pews, scream, sing, yell, run around, lay down in the aisle, on and on. But there was a certain threshold that it seemed the mother was watching for when she would finally get up. And as I said, it was bizarre because the mother would take this little child by the hand and walk her back and then let her go again. And like I said, when my little ones were in church, they were in arms. My wife was either holding the little children or I was holding the little. I can remember those early years when my kids were little. I can remember my back and arms aching during Mass because I was holding a 3-year-old kid so that he'd behave well during Mass. I can remember having my eyes down the aisle throughout the service, throughout the Mass, keeping an eye on the kids, making sure they weren't goofing around or talking to each other or playing with anything. That's why they were quiet during Mass. That's why also they receive many benefits. That's why they're invited to serve at the altar. That's why they're offered jobs as young teenagers, and they're sought out as assistants for faith formation classes and all these other privileges. It's because they were known to be children with good habits. The discipline of their youth, which was unpleasant when they're getting punished for bad behavior and trained to be good, that was unpleasant, but the fruits of that training were pleasant, not just for us, not just for our neighbors, but also for our children. And those are benefits and advantages that parents earn for their children. They earn for their children the respect of the community by disciplining them. And as I said, the same standards that are necessary at church are necessary at home. And yeah, there's a relaxation at home. Of course there is. There's a relaxation in clothing. There's a relaxation in activities and things like that. But there are still principles. The same principles are still true at home that are true at Mass. And if those principles are not taught and enforced all day, every day at home, how are they going to be taught and enforced at Mass? And that's what's unfortunate, is the lack of discipline and training at home is simply revealed when the kids are brought to Mass. They don't even listen to their mother's voice. Their eyes are not on their mother. And you notice that I've said mother, mother, mother. Often the fathers aren't even there, which is another part of the problem. But if my wife were to take our children to Mass by herself even, they'd be under control. Not because she would be all over them and stay on top of them, but because they were trained and it was their custom to act a certain way. And they would know that if they were bad for Mom would tell Dad, and they would have to pay the consequences. And my kids, to be honest, my kids think I'm a little crazy, because they know that when it's time to deal with bad behavior, the consequences may be very great. They don't know what I would do. And it's good for them to have that kind of a respect for their parents and a concern that if they choose to be bad, they're going to pay for it. The principle that I teach my kids as far as discipline and penalties are concerned is, if you can choose to do what you want, then I'm going to choose to do what I want. If you don't want me to do what I want, then you can't choose to do what you want. That's a very simple principle. And the kids learn very quickly that it's not a good idea to have Dad do what he wants. Because all the stuff that the kids possess is actually Dad's. Toys, bikes, food, on and on. Do you really want Dad to be challenged to do whatever he wants? No. Therefore, you need to control yourself. And this isn't some crazy principle. This is the same principle that God himself teaches us. He teaches us that if we want him to be merciful to us, then we need to be merciful to others. And if we're merciless to others, he's going to be merciless to us. Same principle. But my children understand that they make the decision. They control what I do by their decision. But again, they're taught and trained this constantly, all day, every day. We don't have to introduce rules when we go out in public. They know my mannerisms. They know my facial expressions. I can make a tick with my tongue and they know to sit up straight. They're disciplined all day, every day, and then our family enjoys the benefits of that discipline when we go out in public. And that's why we don't need this heroic mother yelling at her kids in public, teaching them the rules in public, and pretending like she's a responsible parent because she's explaining to a child that you shouldn't throw things at other people. Well, that should be taught at home. They should already know that. The fact that a mother has to explain that in the sanctuary is not a sign that this mother is an observant mother. It's a sign that she's not teaching this at home and training these habits at home where they need to be taught. To give another example, earlier in my teaching career, I was a high school basketball coach. And there are some coaches who, during the games, they're running around and yelling at their players and screaming and doing all this stuff. And I was very calm and quiet as a coach because what I told my players is, I have all week to train you to play, to teach you our game plan and strategy, to teach you and train you in all the skills that we need and to condition you for the games. I have the whole preseason and all week at practice to teach you and train you and prepare you for the game. And when the game begins, it's too late for all that stuff. I'm not going to run around like a maniac during the game. I'm going to make notes. I'm going to watch how you perform and what you do. And then after the game, or even during the game, I'm going to make quiet decisions and adjustments that help our team win. But I'm not going to run wild on the court during the game because that's not the appropriate place. For example, I'm not going to yell at a kid because he doesn't do something right in front of a crowd. That's not the right place to deal with that problem. If that kid is really as bad as the coach makes him appear by chewing him out in public, why is the kid playing in the first place? Maybe the coach picked the wrong kid for the position. Maybe the coach didn't teach the kid well what he's supposed to do. And if that kid can't do it, maybe the coach should have chosen somebody else to do it. But if it turns out that that kid actually is the best kid on the team for that position, what's the coach yelling about? It's his best player. The best player for that role, at least. That's why he's on the court. And the same thing is true when we bring our kids to church. That's not the place to yell at them and teach them and train them. And, these crazy parents who are like talking to their kids out loud, telling them how to behave and telling them what to... That's not the place for that. It's not the place to train the kids. They need to be trained at home so that if they're brought to church, they already know how to behave. And if you bring your kids to church and they don't know how to behave, you can take them to a cry room or take them for a walk so that they don't distract other parishioners. And I know that people will object to that, but I would argue that the people who think I'm the one who's wrong are people who are, part of this generation. It's like the people who are smashing windows and burning buildings down in protests and then yelling at the cops for handling them too roughly when they arrest them for breaking the law. No, it's not the cops who are wrong. It's the looters who are wrong. It's the people burning down the buildings and breaking the windows who are wrong. But this is how this generation thinks. The people who argue for the golden rule to be observed are called unloving and fascist in modern politics. And the people who are treating their neighbors like, I don't even know what to say, because I can't think this way. If my kids make a noise, I'm going to apologize to a person sitting in the pew. I can't even imagine bringing my kids in, having them annoy and bother other people, and then if those people get annoyed, thinking in my head that those people are the problem. I can't even comprehend how that mindset operates. I can't comprehend breaking the law and then yelling at the police for bruising my wrist when they put the handcuffs on me. I don't understand how that lawless mind works. I don't think like that. And I don't understand how people think like that. That the parishioners who've come to Mass to listen to the readings and pray and sing and contemplate on this mystery of the Eucharist, they are the bad people because they get annoyed by this child let loose or allowed to scream for no reason throughout the service. I don't understand that mentality, and I'm perfectly happy to be disagreed with. I'm perfectly happy to be criticized, and I'm not going to change on this point. The problem in such a situation is with the parents of the children, not the parishioners. And if there's a jolly old pastor who wants to say things like, "Oh, I love when the children are screaming and crying in the that's not a responsible pastor, because why not cancel the liturgy of the word? Why not just cancel the readings? No one can hear them. Why even bother with the homily? No one has any idea what was said. Why even say the prayers out loud? No one knows what the prayer was, because all we heard were the screaming children. If the screaming children are a beautiful part of the liturgy, why not just cancel the public readings and prayers, because we have no idea what's being said anyway. And if what is being read is significant, then it would seem logical that the children should be required to be kept quiet. So the whole thing makes no sense, when really there's one simple solution. And the simple solution is, parents, control your own children. That should be common sense. It should be. Now, again, the reason why I am interested in talking about this is not because I go to Mass and judge other people, because I know that at Mass it's too late. It's not the time to fuss about it. It's not the place to solve it. It's already out of control. That's why I carry a missal when I go to Mass, because I'm going to read and make sure I pay attention to the readings and know the words of the prayers, so that when I say amen, I'm actually saying amen to something, not just going through the motions. So I'm going to make sure that I know what the readings were, and I know what the words spoken were, and what the prayers were, and I sing the songs and have the lyrics in front of me. I'm going to take care of those things for myself. But unfortunately, most aren't going to do that. And that's a negative influence in the church. But I'm not going to fuss about it at church. I can overcome it by taking measures that allow me to enjoy the Mass. My concern, as I said at the beginning of this, my concern is not for this, because really the government and management of the church is not my responsibility. It's the pastor's responsibility. It's the responsibility of the deacon and the ushers, men who have volunteered to take on this work, and they often don't do it. My concern is, as a teacher, I have to be honest and tell parents, if you don't discipline your children, the bad habits that they develop because of this lack of discipline, the bad behavior is going to prevent them from being able to undertake real Catholic studies. They're not going to be able to do the schoolwork that's required to have a classical Catholic education because their behavior is going to disqualify them from these studies. That's what concerns me as a teacher. Their behavior is going to make progress impossible. And it's not going to matter how much money you throw at it. It's not going to matter how many different methods and programs and strategies and fad educational programs it's not going to overcome this glaring, fixable problem, which is that children who are not disciplined are going to suffer for that lack of discipline. It's not cute. It's not funny. They may be happy because they're allowed to dump their sippy cup over their head on the floor, and mommy can giggle at it like the mother in the Christmas story who has her child eating like a piggy at the table. That's cute to laugh at on television. But that behavior, that lack of discipline, is going to make the child suffer in many different ways. And what's worse is as the children grow, they get louder and stronger and more potentially troublesome. And if those bad habits are not nipped in the bud, you're not going to stop them when the kids are bigger and louder and stronger and more destructive. The opportunity to stop them is when the children are young. When these bad habits first start to develop, that's when they need to be rooted out. And if they're not rooted out then, you're going to have a mess to deal with in older children, and without the grace of God, it's not going to be possible to correct it. It's just like gardening. When you plant a new garden, the soil is tilled, all the weeds have been killed, the soil is clean, you plant the seeds, everything is fresh. You have a new beginning. It's sort of the mercy of the seasons, is that if last summer you lost control of the gardens, winter comes, everything dies down, you get a second chance the following spring to start over again. You plant the seeds, the soil is freshly cultivated, and what will happen after a week or 2 weeks is the first weeds will start to appear. And you can go out in the garden and just reach down and very easily pull them out by hand or cover them with a hoe, and that's it. And if you stay on top of it day by day, week by week, the work of caring for the garden remains that simple. It's very light work to just pluck up a new weed, cover up some weeds with a hoe. Very, very light, simple work. But if you leave it for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, those weeds are given the opportunity to set their roots and become strong and grow a foot tall. And when you go out there, having let these weeds develop, you're going to have a miserable task of clearing the garden of those weeds. And it's your fault that it's so difficult. And you're going to get to a point, if you continue to neglect it, you're going to get to a point where that garden season is lost. The plants that were planted are dead. The seeds that were planted were choked out. The weeds have taken over the whole garden. The growing season is already too far gone. And your neglect to care for the weeds and to remove them at the proper time caused the whole garden to be lost. And unlike a garden, with our children, we don't get a second season to start over again. we don't get a second chance. They have one childhood. We don't have a second chance. And if you allow these bad habits to grow like weeds, rather than deal with them when everything is green and fresh, you're going to find that it runs out of control. And your children are going to be dependent upon others intervening. They're going to be dependent upon people outside your family intervening, like the police. And the police are going to deal with them in a very different way. They may suffer financially. They may suffer with relationships. They may be hated by their community because they're bad people. We study these characters in Theophrastus' characters in the academy. These weeds need to be pulled out and kept from growing when they first appear. And if they're not pulled early, it gets harder and harder to pull them over time, and it gets to a point where it's out of our control as parents. Now, let me say one last thing before I wrap up. This has nothing to do with adult children who make their own choices once they become independent. The scriptures teach us that if you train up a child in the way he should go when he is older, he will not depart from it. And that's a mysterious proverb that has a long-term fulfillment. It doesn't mean that if you train up a child in the way he should go, he will never depart from it temporarily. It says when he is old, he will not depart from it. In other words, he will return to it. And we often see this. We often see children who are well raised, when they enter adulthood and gain their independence, make the decision to go against everything they've been taught, throw off all of their disciplines, and go like the prodigal son and run into the gutter. And like the prodigal son, they return to the way that they were taught they should go when they were young, after terrible trials and suffering. And it's a mercy if they get that chance, because many of them don't live through that period. We hear the stories of drug use and overdoses and accidents and suicides, murders, imprisonment, on and on. Many don't get the chance to make it to that time where the prodigal son can go home. And that should terrify us as parents. But we'll often see adult children make terrible decisions, and they will pay the price for them, and we have to allow them to pay the price for them. Now, the benefit of our legal system is that when our children turn 18 years old, when they're capable of taking responsibility for their own life, the parents are no longer responsible. The responsibility of parents is temporary. As I said, it's when the children are young, when they're minors. When the children turn 18, they are legally responsible for themselves. And if you think in the church, confirmation comes around age 15. And so both the church and the state, by the time our children are leaving their teenage years, both the church and the state are saying, this child is no longer the responsibility of his parents. This child is responsible for himself. And so what adult children choose to do has nothing to do with the responsibility of parents. When we talk about controlling our children, we're talking about minors who are in our control and for whom we are responsible, both morally and legally. Now, I can share one thing. In my family, I take this very seriously. In our society, children are given privileges that they should not be given. For example, children are allowed to drive and get driver's licenses when they're 16 and 17 years old. Now, notice that children are allowed to drive before they are legally responsible for their behavior. This is, in my opinion, insanity. As a rule in my household, no one is allowed to get a driver's license until they turn 18 years old, when they're personally responsible for what they do in a vehicle. If my child goes out on the road in a vehicle, chooses to speed, chooses to fool around, and injures someone or destroys someone else's property, no one is sending that bill to me. I have no interest in that liability, and I'm never allowing a minor child to drive a car that I'm not in or in control of. And it's this kind of thing that we have to be careful of. If my child says, hey, you know what, I'm getting a sports car and I'm going to race around town, look, you can do that when you're 18, and if you cause any trouble, all of the bills and all of the lawsuits are going to come to you, not to me. And as parents, we have to be careful of these things. At age 18, our children are legally independent. We're no longer responsible for their behavior. They answer for themselves. But when they're young, we are responsible for their behavior, and we are to answer for them. And if we don't take this responsibility seriously, if we allow ourselves to get caught up in this insane age of irreverence and disobedience, and start to think with this depraved mind that these children out of control are okay and the people disturbed by them are the bad guys, our children, if not disciplined, are going to suffer in a million different ways. And it's not cute. And we have to stop winking at it and smiling at it and realize that this idea has to be eliminated, because we have to raise disciplined children for the sake of their participation in activity at church, in their studies, in their reputation and respect in our communities and so on. We have to discipline our children because we can provide them with many, many good things through that discipline. And if we leave them undisciplined, we can leave them to suffer many, many things that could have been avoided. And worst of all, if we don't deal with these things when they're young, they're going to get out of control, and it's very possible that they can be lost, and it'd be our responsibility. I don't know about you, but that keeps me up at night, and that's why I take the discipline of my children seriously.